Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. If I can have my dear brothers and sisters to please go ahead and be seated so we can start the program promptly, inshallah. Salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا وحبيبنا وحبيب إله العالمين بالقاسم محمد اللهم صل على My dear brothers and sisters, welcome to our first night of Muharram program that is going to be inshallah continued till the 10th of Muharram, which is going to be September the 10th. And that's going to be our last program for this Muharram of this year. A couple announcements before we recite the Holy Quran, and then inshallah we'll invite our honorable brother Sayyid Hadi Qazwini to the podium. We have a teacher who's a professional upstairs. If you have children who won't be able to sit down with us here for about an hour and a half period of time, you can send them upstairs. And I urge you to do so because they're going to teach them. There's a lot of things, fun things they're going to have upstairs. So please send your children if they cannot be under complete control of yours. We had some of our sisters saying that if we could have a place, those of our sisters who have small children, they wanted to have a place so they can sit with their own children as well as listening to the lecture simultaneously. We are doing that right now. We have that. If you have small children that they cannot be quiet enough in this room, they can go to the meeting room right there, and it's going to be, we have a live stream. It just goes directly. You can watch it. You can watch the whole program on the big screen that we have there. So please do so before we start. And we need the sponsors for these nice dinners so we can continue giving dinners. We had one sponsor for tonight, but the nights to come we have another 10 more nights we have actually. So please, if you want to help out with these nights, see me after the program, inshallah. May Allah protect you. Salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم فاذكروني أذكركم واشكروا لي ولا تكفرون. يا أيها الذين آمنوا استعينوا بالصبر والصلاة إن الله مع الصابرين. ولا تقولوا لمن يقتل في سبيل الله أموات بل أحياء ولكن لا تشعرون. ولنبلونكم بشيء من الخوف والجوع ونقص من الأموال والأنفس والثمرات وبشر الصابرين الذين إذا أصابتهم مصيبة قالوا إنا لله وإنا إليه راجعون. أولئك عليهم صلوات من ربهم ورحمة أولئك عليهم صلوات من ربهم ورحمة وأولئك هم المهتدون. صدق الله العلي العظيم. صلوات. We're going to continue the program with the speech of our honorable brother Sayyid Hadi al-Qazwini, and after that we're going to have lamentation, Farsi and Arabic, inshallah, right after that. So please help me out and invite the Sayyid to the podium of the salawat.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. صلى الله وسلم عليك يا سيدي ويا مولاي يا رسول الله. صلى الله وسلم عليك يا سيدي ويا مولاي يا أبا عبد الله. يا غريب يا شهيد كربلاء يا ليتنا كنا معكم سادتي فنفوز فوزا عظيما. قال الله تعالى في محكم كتابه الكريم: بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. لقد كان في قصصهم عبرة لأولي الألباب ما كان حديثا يفترى ولكن تصديق الذي بين يديه وتفصيل كل شيء وهدى ورحمة لقوم يؤمنون. God states in the Holy Quran, in the name of God, most gracious, most merciful, certainly in their stories is a lesson for those possessed of intellect. It is not a fabricated account. Rather, it is a confirmation of that which came before it, and an elaboration of all things, and the guidance and mercy for a people who believe. Amanna billah, sadaqallahu al-aliyyul azim. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. Tonight is the eve of the first of Muharram. It is the beginning of the new Islamic year, but also the beginning of the season of Ashura. And it is a time where tens of millions around the world begin by commemorating the life, the legacy, and the sacrifice of Abi Abdullah al-Hussein and his family members and his companions. And with the start of this season, this important time, we find ourselves faced with an oft-repeated question, sometimes in the form of an objection, that states that why is it that we continue year after year? Why is it that we continue to remember these historical events, these events that occurred 1,400 years ago? Perhaps the one putting forth this question or this objection would suggest that as tragic as those events were, as distressful as the murder of Imam Hussein and his family members and his companions were, as heart-wrenching as this incident is, despite all of this, should we not let bygones be bygones? Should we not let the history keep history in the past, let the past remain in the past, and instead of spending so much time and effort and energy recalling the past, instead we should focus on the present. We should focus on what is relevant to our lives today. Why do we insist on recalling events, remembering a history that is not even recent? It's an ancient history. It is long ago that these events occurred. Now, this question or this objection is symptomatic of broader concerns regarding the significance of studying and knowing history in general, and Islamic history, especially early Islamic history in particular. And thus we find that for some, history is just that, it's history. It should be treated as history. It should remain in the past. It has no relevance for us today. Let's keep it in the past, where it belongs. I read a study recently that says that only 25%, 1/4, 25% of American high school students are competent in basic U.S. history. Only 25%. The vast majority, they are incompetent in United States history, in the history of their country. Another study tells us that only 1/3, about 33% of Americans are capable of passing the citizenship exam. They were given an exam which contained 20 multiple choice questions about basic U.S. history, which appears in a standard citizenship, U.S. citizenship exam. And only 1/3, 2/3 of those who took that exam, they failed to pass, meaning they failed to achieve at least 60%. They got an F. They were not able to get a D, even a D. And that this number is greater with those who are under the age of 45. Only 20%, 1 in 5, were able to successfully pass the U.S. citizenship exam. Now, what these studies and others tell us, they reveal to us an embarrassing truth. And that is that most are indifferent to history. And what is worse is that they are indifferent to their own history. We're not talking about, global history, or history of the world, or history of other parts of the world. We're talking about U.S. history, our own history, our own background. That most are indifferent to history. So some, they suggest that let's keep the past in the past. They are indifferent to history. Others, they may not necessarily be indifferent to history, but they consider history to be boring. It's boring. If you're having a hard time sleeping, just pick up a history book and you'll be snoozing very quickly. Or it's impractical or irrelevant to my life. There are some who consider the history to be irrelevant, to be impractical. And so the important question that we have to ask is, what is the significance of studying and knowing history, and how is history relevant to our world today? Is it relevant or is it not relevant? What's the significance of knowing history and studying history? Now, the answer to this question simply is that without knowledge of and understanding of history, we can't make sense of our world today or even ourselves. In fact, the Quran alludes to this point. In the very last verse of Surah Yusuf, chapter number 12, the very last verse, verse 111, God says, لَقَدْ كَانَ فِي قَصَصِهِمْ عِبْرَةٌ لِأُولِي الْأَلْبَابِ. We know that the Quran contains many narratives, many stories of past generations, those who came before the Prophet and the early community, hundreds of years before. The Quran gives narrative stories about them. Here God says, certainly in their stories is a lesson for those possessed of intellect. It's not just a matter of relating the history or being aware of it, so that when I'm asked what happened in so-and-so year or what happened at this time, I know. But that the relation and understanding of these historical events has lessons for those, according to the Quran, who have intellect. لَقَدْ كَانَ فِي قَصَصِهِمْ عِبْرَةٌ لِأُولِي الْأَلْبَابِ. We have to know history in order to make sense of our world, to make sense of ourselves. And the reason for this is because history is everywhere. Everywhere we turn, everywhere we look, there is history. Each of us as an individual is part of a living history. And as a collective, as a group, we form part of a collective history and a collective memory when we come to ourselves as individuals. Even our physical compositions, we find we recognize through genetic structures, through genomes. These genetic structures are what? They have a history to them. They are passed on. Some of these structures, some of this DNA is passed on. There is a history to it. So I, as an individual, do not appear without a history. There's a history to my physical composition, my physical being as an individual. When it comes to our collective history, take the example of language. How do we learn language? Do we learn language by ourselves? No. We find that we learn language as children, as infants. We learn language through a socialization process. We hear others around us, our parents, our siblings, family members. We hear this language and we begin to form the language. We don't go through a formal education, right? A child is not given formal education of how to speak, what a word means. He or she begins to learn this. Now, this language itself also has a history. The language that we speak has a history to it, where changes occurred, where words were brought in, where there were shifts. So the language that we speak has a history. The nationality that I identify with has a history. The nation that I belong to has a history. The technology that we use has a history. Right? The phones that we use, the smartphones today, it has a history. The other forms of technology, forms of communication, all of these, they have a history to them. And so everywhere we turn, everywhere we look, there is history. As individuals, we are part of history. As groups, we are part of history. And so we find that through knowledge of and awareness of history, different forms of history, we are able as individuals to extend our lifespan. What's the average life expectancy for the average person here in the US? About 79 years old, I think. Right? It may depend on whether you're male or female, but generally average is 79 years old. By knowing your history, by knowing various histories, we are able to extend this lifespan. We connect with figures and individuals and communities that came before us, and so we extend our experience and our understanding. And so it is to understand our present, where we are today, how I am composed, our present state. It is essential that we understand and that we know the past and history. Part of it is for our ability to improve. Right? I gave several examples of language and culture and technology. When we look at other areas of our life, when we know the history, we are able to improve on the successes and the developments of those who came before us and to work towards a better situation. We see this in medicine, right? In medicine, there is a history to this medicine. The doctor does not come and reinvent the wheel. The doctor, the physician, is building upon a long history, a tradition of medicine, a tradition of science. And the same with scholarship. Scholarship is the same. When you enter and you pursue any field of scholarship, any discipline, you find that it has a history. And so what ends up happening is that when we know this history, when we understand and we recognize this history, we are able to take advantage of the developments and the successes of those who came before us in order to further develop, in order to develop our present and to develop the future. On the other hand, there are major harms in ignoring or forgetting history. We're all aware of the popular aphorism that tells us that those who cannot remember history are condemned to repeat it. Right? If we're not able, if we ignore the history, if we forget the history, then we are condemned to repeat the mistakes of history. Just like when we know the history, we are able to take advantage of the successes and the opportunities and to develop them. If we don't know the history, then we run the risk of making and repeating the same mistakes that occurred in history. Now, how does history forgetting occur? There are two main ways that history forgetting occurs. One way is what we can refer to as the blatant or intentional erasure of history. Right? It's a conscientious erasure of history. Someone consciously, intentionally decides they want to erase history. They want to misrepresent the history. Right? And we have many examples of this in our history. When we look at one example that's relevant to our situation today, for example, when we look at how some historical records, they present the way in which the early U.S. settlers, those who came to the United States from Europe and other places, when they came, the way that they are depicted in how they dealt with the natives of this land, whom we call the Native Americans. If you study standard history books in school, they don't tell you the whole picture. In fact, they give you a distorted picture of what happened. And this is why we find that an example, a prominent example of this would be the case of like Thanksgiving. When you go and you read about Thanksgiving, you're given a picture that Thanksgiving was this beautiful celebration, this feast that occurred between the pilgrims, between the settlers, and between the natives, and they were all getting along, and they were giving thanks for their blessings, and so on and so forth. But for many people, Thanksgiving today, until today, Thanksgiving is a day of mourning. It's a day of sadness. It's not a day of happiness. It's not a day of festivities. Because for them, there's a history here that included death and destruction and murder and enslavement of their forefathers, the Native Americans. But we don't necessarily read about this. We're given a picture in which some of these important elements of the historical record, they're erased. They're misrepresented. So this is one. One form of history forgetting occurs through an intentional erasure of history. The second occurs whereby the history is there. It's not erased for the most part. There are elements of the history there, but we choose to ignore the history, or we choose to follow, but to follow uncritically. We know the history is there, but we choose to ignore it. We want to put it aside. We don't want to think about it. We do not want to remember it. Or we are given a certain picture, a certain idea of what the history is, and we follow blindly without being critical, without going and asking, is this accurate? Is everything that I'm told here, is this accurate? An accurate portrayal? And so many people, they think they know history, but the history that they know, they have followed uncritically, or they have ignored the history. They have chosen to ignore. And so what is said of history in general is also true, brothers and sisters, regarding Islamic history in particular. We have these same sort of problems. If we want to understand in large part the present situation of Islam and Muslims in the world, it is essential for us to understand the history of this tradition, the history of this religion, the history of Islam and Muslims, and especially the early history of Islam. It's essential. Without recognizing what happened in the early history of Islam, we are not able to make sense of what's happening today, the present state of Islam and Muslims. And one of the major events, a turning point in the early Islamic history, were the events that surrounded the martyrdom of Abi Abdullah al-Husayn. This was a turning point in the history of Islam and in the history of the world. A major event, a major turning point. And this example, the example of Imam Hussein and the example of Karbala and Ashura, is a remarkable example of an event that also is subject to those same two processes of history forgetting. Number one, the blatant and intentional erasure of history. We find several attempts ongoing from the early period, from that early period until today, where this history is misrepresented intentionally. There's misrepresentation. There's a different story that is given. When we read some of the historical accounts, we find, sometimes you read some things and they just shock you. You're shocked. Sometimes you might hear something, you read something, and you can find, sort of an answer for it. You can find a, solution. You say, well, it could possibly be this or that. Sometimes you read something and you're shocked. How is it possible, for example, that when the women and the children, the captives after Ashura, when they were taken, they were paraded in captivity, in chains, and the heads of the martyrs were placed on the lances, and they were paraded to Kufa, and then from Kufa to Damascus. We have records that tell us that the people, when they saw this, they were celebrating. Why? Because they assumed that these were major rebels, that these were non-Muslims, they were kuffar, they had rebelled against the state, against the caliph, and they found their end, they found their demise. This is what people thought. Why? Because you had a huge propaganda machine. You had energy and influence and power that portrayed the picture as such. And this is why we have some accounts that tell us that some people, when they realized that this is the family of the Prophet, these are the grandchildren of the Prophet, they realized this and they recognized what had happened. From that time, and then in the decades following, for 6 decades at least, 60 years at least, in the early Umayyad period, we find that the cursing of Ali ibn Abi Talib was instituted as part of the Friday sermon. Allahu Akbar. As part of the Friday sermon. That Imam Ali and his progeny, his family, would be cursed by the khatib. And so you have generations of families that grew up thinking that Ali ibn Abi Talib did not pray. Allahu Akbar. How is it possible? The man who was born inside the house of God, in the Kaaba, the one who was assassinated in the house of God, in Masjid al-Kufa, he did not pray? But you had people, because there was a propaganda machine that intentionally erased the history. And it continues until today. It continues. Look at the world today. This event comes, Muharram comes, Ashura comes, and you rarely hear about it except from a select group of people, especially the followers of Ahlul Bayt. You hear about it. Otherwise, many Muslims themselves, let alone those who have no knowledge of Islam, no knowledge of these events, many Muslims themselves. So this is one way in which this event was intentionally erased, attempts to intentionally erase it and misrepresent it. The other is that no, the history is there. People are aware of the history, they've studied the history, they've read what happened. They are very well aware, but they choose to ignore this history. They choose to ignore it. They choose to put it aside. Some people are even unaware of this history. I've met many people myself, and perhaps you in the audience know of people who were unaware. They had no clue what happened in the early period of Islam, in the early history. They have no idea that the grandson of the Prophet, the one who the Prophet himself, he said, Husaynun minni wa ana min Husayn. Husayn is from me, I am from Husayn. This person, this figure who was not only related in blood to the Prophet, but had such a great position in the eyes of the Prophet himself, and before that in the eyes of God, that they have no clue. They've told me, I've never heard this story. I had no clue that this happened. Allahu Akbar. But what's worse than this is that those who know, but they choose to ignore. Because you can give someone an excuse. You tell them, you did not have access to certain records. You may have grown up in an environment that, did not give you the history, veiled this history from you. But there are those who know the history, but they still choose to ignore it. And this occurs. This occurs even until today. Many of today's tragedies and challenges, as well as the opportunities and successes, can be traced to similar historical circumstances in the early period of Islam. When we read history, we know that when the Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam, Allahumma salli ala, when he was mandated by God to begin this message, when the first revelation came to him and he was spreading this message, we know that the context in Arabia was one in which certain values were prized. Tribal affiliations, economic stature, strengths, military, economic strength, these were prized in that region. And the Prophet came with a radical idea of social change and social justice. And he worked tirelessly, day and night and day, in order to transform this society, in order to change this society. He came with a major message, a message that is exemplified in verses of the Quran, such as the 13th verse of Surah Al-Hujurat, chapter 49, Ya ayyuhan nas, inna khalaqnakum min dhakarin wa untha, وَجَعَلْنَاكُمْ شُعُوبًا وَقَبَائِلَ لِتَعَارَفُوا إِنَّ أَكْرَمَكُمْ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ أَتْقَاكُمْ. A major message. This was such a powerful message, a radical message, that, oh people, put aside these prized values that you have of tribalism, of my tribe, of asabiyya, usness, at the expense of others. It's us, not you. It is my tribe, not yours. It is the wealth that I have. It is the power that I have. Put these all aside. Why? Because the most valuable of you in the sight of God is the most God-conscious, is the most righteous, is the one who is able to do good to others. The Prophet came with a message that all of those who recognized God and obeyed God, they were equal in the eyes of God. The standard of worth was how good you could be to yourself and to others, to your nafs. Yourself meaning your nafs, not your body, not your family, but to your nafs. Whether you can purify it or not. Whether what you did was sincerely for God and for the betterment of society or not. This was the standard of worth that the Prophet brought forth. He came forward and he told the people, "O people, no one is better than the other, no Arab or non-Arab. All of you are equal in the eyes of God." This was a radical message. And he spent 23 years constantly preaching this message. Not just preaching it, but exemplifying it in his own life, in his own character, in his own attributes, that of himself and his family members and those around him, his companions. So you had this sort of change, radical shift in society, where a large segment understood different values to be worthy of recognition. But then you come afterwards, very early on after the Prophet. The Prophet departs this world, and slowly you start to see those old values rearing their heads again. These new values of God consciousness, righteousness, equality, goodness, they start to fade away. And you have a society that begins to develop once again based on those old values of favoritism, of tribalism. And you see this especially with the Umayyads. The Umayyads who come and to reintroduce, they don't invent, they reintroduce these ugly values that were held before. They reintroduce them through their own character, through their own exemplification. And so this process reemerges once again. You find their lavish and indecent lifestyles. If you go to the historical record, it tells us that when Umar ibn al-Khattab, when he had appointed Muawiyah we know as the first Umayyad, the institutor of the Umayyad dynasty, the father of Yazid, Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, the son of Abu Sufyan. That Umar ibn al-Khattab, he had appointed Muawiyah in his earlier position in Ash-Sham. But then it was not until later that he gained prominence to become the governor. Umar, the records, they tell us that Umar one day he went to visit Muawiyah in Ash-Sham, and he came back and he described what he saw. He described Muawiyah's personality. And he described him in a single word, in a single phrase. He said Muawiyah is living the life of the Khusro of Persia, the Sasanian king. He is living a life of royalty. This is Umar's description of Muawiyah. And there are many others, many other descriptions that are found of the individual lifestyle of these people. And it became, of course, worse with Yazid. We're all familiar with what kind of character Yazid ibn Muawiyah had. So you had all of these values come back once again. Tribal favoritism, economic inequality, and all of these things that the Prophet fought so hard to extinguish, to change in society. And then you have Imam Hussein. Imam Hussein who comes, he realizes, he sees what has happened in society. And this was a process, brothers and sisters. I don't have time to give you, obviously, the comprehensive history, but this was a process from the departure of the Prophet all the way until the time of Imam Hussein. Imam Hussein dies in the year 61, 50 years after the Prophet. Half a century this process is happening. Half a century, right? And so you can imagine how it has affected the society. This was not just the caliphs sitting there and doing their own thing. This affects society. الناس على دين ملوكهم. They look to those who are in positions of power, in positions of leadership, and they are either inspired, they are either encouraged or discouraged. If their leaders do good, the people are encouraged to do good. But if the leaders themselves are not good, what happens to the people? What happens to them? So Imam Hussein comes, he recognizes this sad state of affairs of the Muslim community. And he takes a stand. He takes a stand. He realizes that this is not sustainable. If it continues this way, khalas, there will be no more recognition of Islam. Islam will be gone. The Islam, maybe by name, will be there. But the true Islam that his grandfather, his father, he himself, other noble companions of the Prophet, they worked so hard to institute, it would have vanished very soon. And so he resisted. He stood up. He realized that he stood up. He realized his responsibility to stand up, to rise. And this is one example, brothers and sisters, of the urgency of the matter. This is why this event is so important to us. One example of why it's so important. As Muslims, as individuals, and as members of society collectively, this is why it becomes for us so important to continue to recall, to understand, because in these distant events there are enduring lessons. These lessons, they continue for us. As I mentioned, the Quran says that in the portrayal of the stories of ancient prophets, those who came before, there are lessons for those possessed of intellect, that they take advantage, they learn, and they are able to work towards changing, realizing if we as individuals and communities, we want to realize where we are today, our state as Muslims today, the state of the Islamic Ummah, the Islamic community, as individuals and as a group, it is essential for us to pay attention to history, to learn the history, not to ignore it, to be able to spend some time and effort to gain knowledge and awareness of our history, especially the early history of Islam, so that we can learn, so that as individuals and as a group we can avoid the mistakes of history. That God forbid we don't lapse into that state in which the Muslim community was headed to during the time of Imam Hussein. Because if we don't, then we risk repeating the same mistakes. We risk losing all of those values that the Quran and the Prophet and the Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam, they worked so hard to teach us and to preserve for us. We run the risk. And this is why it's so important for us to remember. And inshallah, over the coming nights, I plan to, God willing, to explore some of the major lessons and the major themes of Ashura and the early history of Islam in particular, and their relevance to us today. How do we understand these lessons? First of all, what are they? And how do we understand them? And how are they relevant for our lives today, in the present, and in the future? Finally, going back to the original question of why is it important to recall this history? Besides the point that I've elaborated, another important point is that commemorating Ashura, commemorating the martyrdom of Imam Hussein ibn Ali alayhim as-salam, and his family members and his companions and the events surrounding this event, is also a clear example of the prophetic teaching and tradition itself. Our sources, they tell us that recalling, remembering Imam Hussein, thinking about Hussein, pondering about Imam Hussein and these events was not something that occurred during that specific time and afterwards only. That long before the tragic day of Ashura, that there was a tradition of understanding what would happen on the day of Ashura. That the reports tell us that the ancient prophets and those who came before Imam Hussein hundreds of years before, God had given them insight in what would happen on the day of Ashura. That they recognized. They were given this insight. They knew that this event would occur in the future through knowledge that God had given them of these events. They tell us that the souls of these prophets in the heavens, the hadith, one hadith that is narrated in the famous traditionist, the book of the famous traditionist Ibn Qulawayh. The book is known as Kamil al-Ziyarat. Very well known in the tradition. Ibn Qulawayh died 1,000 years ago. He compiled this book of traditions about the state of ziyarat, the different pilgrimages and the different salutations to the places of burial of the Prophet and the Imams and other figures. He mentions a hadith in this book, in Kamil al-Ziyarat, where he says that on certain occasions, the souls of the prophets in the heavens, they beseech God. They desperately pray to God. They desperately beseech God to give them permission to descend from the heavens and to visit Abi Abdullah al-Hussein, to pay their respects and their salutations, the souls of the prophets, to pay their respects to Imam Hussein alayhi salam. This is a tradition, an ancient prophetic tradition. This is why we recognize Imam Hussein very famously as the heir of the ancient prophets. Assalamu alayka ya waritha Adam safwatillah. Adam, the heir of Adam. Assalamu alayka ya waritha Nuh nabiyillah. Assalamu alayka ya waritha Ibrahim khalilillah. Assalamu alayka ya waritha Musa kalimillah. Assalamu alayka ya waritha Isa ruhillah. Assalamu alayka ya waritha Muhammad Rasulullah. He's their heir. He's linked to the ancient prophets. He goes back to them. And it's reciprocal, brothers and sisters. He goes back to them and they were looking forward to Hussein. And so this is a tradition of the ancient prophets. I'd like to end, brothers and sisters, by sharing with you a very short poem that I wrote a long time ago. Hajar, the wife of Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam. Hajar runs between two hills and suddenly stops. Hajar runs between two hills and suddenly stops when her baby is silenced by Zamzam's flow. Zainab stands on the hill, shocked, in great distress, when her nephew is silenced by that arrow. Ibrahim is commanded to sacrifice his son Ismail in order to succeed. Ibrahim is commanded by God to sacrifice his son Ismail in order to succeed Hussein. Hussein is destined to take Ismail's place. But before him, his family will proceed. Yaqub is then separated from Yusuf. Yaqub is then separated from Yusuf. He sheds so many tears until he can't see. Hussein watches his brave Ali charge forward. Ali al-Akbar. Hussein watches his brave Ali charge forward. It's as if who's charging is God's appointee. Musa was called to meet with his Lord for days. Musa was called to meet with his Lord for days. He scolded his brother Harun when he came back. Hussein calls Abbas. Hussein calls Abbas to quench the children's thirst. He then sees him and cries, "Brother, my back." Then comes Isa, whose humility was great. He would lay on the ground and sleep without stress. Then comes Isa, whose humility was great. He would lay on the ground and sleep without stress. The day would come when Hussein would also lay, drenched completely in blood and on the sand, headless. O Rasulullah, my dearest Muhammad, the loss of your child Qasim was hard to heal. O Rasulullah, my dearest Muhammad, the loss of your child Qasim was hard to heal. My master, forgive me for saying this now, but Hussein's Qasim was struck as he would kneel. I don't know whether to cry for Fatima or whether to shed tears for al-Baneen. I don't know whether to cry for Fatima or whether to shed tears for al-Baneen. They're brave men who for the sake of God gave their lives so that today for us Islam can be seen. I don't know whether to cry for Fatima or whether to shed tears for Baneen. They're brave men who for the sake of God gave their lives so that today for us Islam can be seen. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. وسيعلم الذين ظلموا آل محمد أي منقلب ينقلبون والعاقبة للمتقين. السلام عليك يا سيدي ويا مولاي يا أبا عبد الله. السلام عليك وعلى الأرواح التي حلت بفنائك. عليكم مني جميعا سلام الله أبدا ما بقيت وبقي الليل والنهار ولا جعله الله آخر العهد مني لزيارتكم. All together, brothers and sisters. السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين. السلام عليكم جميعا ورحمة الله وبركاته. وإلى أرواح المؤمنين والمؤمنات نهدي جميعا ثواب سورة الفاتحة مع الصلوات.
برای سلامتی حاج آقا سید هادی قزوینی صلوات محبت بفرمایید. Before we start the lamentation in Persian, I have a humble request from myself those that they are not even able to speak Farsi, I suggest to sit down for a couple more minutes, because all the people that they are in heaven, they have the regret to be in the session of Imam Hussein. It's extremely important, and I suggest that everyone please stay if you can. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Sallallahu alayka ya Mawlaya ya Aba Abdullah وعلى الأرواح التي هلت بفنائك عليك مني سلام الله أبدا ما بقيت وبقي الليل والنهار ولا جعله الله آخر العهد مني لزيارتكم همه با هم السلام این حسین کیست که عالم همه دیوانه اوست این چه شمعیست که جانها همه پروانه اوست هر کجا می نگرم هر کجا می نگرم نور رخش جلوه گر است هر کجا می گذرم جلوه مستانه اوست هر کسی میل سوی کرب و بلایش دارد من چه دانم که چه سریست در خانه اوست بیا و درد هجران محبان را مداوا کن نگاهی از کرم بر چشمهای بسته ما کن تمام آفرینش بی تو باشد جسم بی جانی بیا با یک نگه بر خلق اعجاز مسیحا کن یا ابن الحسن بیا بیا از غربت جدت بگو با مردم عالم بیا و چشم ما را از سرشک سرخ دریا کن بیا دست یداللهی برون آر از آستین تناب خس را از دستهای عمه‌ات وا کن یا ابن الحسن کجایی گویم سرت سلامت صاحب عزا کجایی گویم سرت سلامت کی می شود بیایی گویم گویم سرت سلامت ای آفتاب زهرا که شام طارقم را چون صبح دم نمایی گویم سرت سلامت یا ابن الحسن کجایی همه یا ابن الحسن گویم سرت سلامت کی می شود بیایی گویم سرت سلامت در ماتم عزای کرب و بلا نشستی ای یار کربلایی گویم سرت سلامت صاحب عزا کجایی گویم سرت سلامت یا ابن الحسن گویم سرت سلامت همه یا ابن الحسن الحسن کجایی یا ابن الحسن کجا جان ره اسلام فدا کرد حسین در مقتل خون خدا کرد حسین در سجده شکر سر جدا شد ز تنش تا حق نماز را ادا کرد حسین حسین جان حسین جان جانم حسین